You know those moments in life when someone you love puts every ounce of their heart and soul into something, thinking it will create memories that last forever, only to have it all come crashing down. That's exactly what happened to my daughter. And honestly, even now, it's hard to put into words just how heartbreaking it was to witness. She spent 3 full days in the kitchen. I'm talking morning till night, barely sitting down, her hands aching, her back sore, yet her spirit completely alive because she wanted this to be perfect. This wasn't just any dinner. This was supposed to be a grand celebration for my mom's 65th birthday. 23 people were invited. 23 plates, 23 sets of forks and knives, and 23 expectations sitting on my daughter's shoulders. She had planned everything down to the tiniest detail: the appetizers, the entrees, the side dishes, the sauces, the desserts, even the drinks. It was like she became this unstoppable creative force, determined to make the night magical. Every time I walked into the kitchen, there she was, surrounded by chaos, flour dusting the counters, bowls stacked precariously, timers going off in the background. Yet somehow she looked happy, humming softly as she stirred a pot or kneaded dough. She wasn't just cooking, she was crafting an experience, something that she believed would make my mom feel incredibly loved. She scoured recipes online, watched tutorial videos, made endless notes in her little recipe journal, and spent hours practicing a few tricky techniques she'd never tried before. She made delicate puff pastry for the appetizers, roasted lamb that marinated for 12 hours, creamy mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, and a homemade herb butter that melted like silk. She didn't just want the food to taste good, she wanted it to look stunning, so she carefully experimented with plating, placing every garnish just right, drizzling sauces like an artist painting on a canvas. What touched me the most was the passion behind it all. She'd pause sometimes, wipe her forehead, and smile to herself, whispering things like, "Grandma's gonna love this," or "This is going to make her so happy." It wasn't about showing off, it was about love. Pure, selfless love. On the second day, when exhaustion was written all over her face, I suggested we simplify the menu, but she shook her head immediately. "No, Mom," she said softly but firmly, "Grandma deserves the best. She does so much for everyone else. This is my way of saying thank you." My heart nearly burst right there. She didn't care how much effort it took, how little sleep she got, or how chaotic the kitchen became. All she cared about was making my mom feel special, and you could see the pride radiating from her, even though she was running on fumes. The smell in our house was intoxicating by the third day: roasted garlic, fresh herbs, warm bread baking in the oven, tangy sauces bubbling on the stove. She had prepped enough food to feed an army, and every single dish was made completely from scratch. No shortcuts, no store-bought mixes, nothing half-done. Just pure effort, love, and attention poured into everything. I remember one night, around midnight, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, her legs stretched out, hands covered in flour, staring at the lemon tart she had just finished. I asked if she was okay, and she just laughed softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I'm okay," she said. "I just really want this to be perfect." That sentence stuck with me. She wasn't cooking to impress anyone. She was cooking because she believed showing love through food was the best way she knew how. On the final night before the party, she stayed up until nearly 3 a.m., carefully layering the triple chocolate mousse she'd made in individual glass cups, spooning the raspberry compote over the cheesecake, and dusting powdered sugar over the lemon tart. The level of care she put into every detail was unreal, and when she finally set everything on the counter and stood back to admire it all, I swear, she looked like an artist stepping away from her masterpiece. She was exhausted but glowing, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. She kept saying, "Grandma's going to love this. Everyone's going to be so happy." She even made handwritten menu cards for every place setting, elegant little pieces of art listing each dish she had prepared, complete with tiny doodles of flowers in the corners. That's how much thought she put into this. By the time the morning of my mom's birthday arrived, our house was buzzing with excitement. The dining table was beautifully set with fresh flowers in mason jars, candles arranged in the center, and crisp linen napkins folded neatly beside the polished silverware. My daughter had even matched the decorations to my mom's favorite colors, soft lavender and ivory, because she wanted the atmosphere to feel personal. She wore a simple but pretty floral dress she'd bought weeks ago just for this occasion, her hair tied back loosely, and there was this quiet nervousness about her. She kept pacing around the kitchen, double-checking the oven, opening the fridge, rearranging dishes for the 10th time, making sure everything was flawless. I could see her heart racing beneath her calm smile, her eyes darting toward the clock as the minutes ticked closer to the time the guests were supposed to arrive. We kept reassuring her, telling her everything was perfect. But she didn't want perfect. She wanted it to be unforgettable, and honestly, in that moment, watching her glow with anticipation and pride, I felt so proud I could cry. What I didn't know then, what none of us could have predicted, was that all of this effort, this love, this dream of a beautiful family celebration, was about to be shattered in a way that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. She had given everything she had, and what came next, I'll never forget the look on her face when it all came crashing down. The morning of my mom's birthday started out perfect. Or at least, that's how it felt at first. There was this quiet sense of accomplishment in the air, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for the celebration to begin. My daughter woke up early, even though she'd barely slept, and immediately rushed to the kitchen to start preparing the final touches. She was focused, determined, and buzzing with this nervous excitement, the kind you feel when something you've been planning for weeks is finally about to happen. She checked every single dish, tasting the sauces, rearranging the serving platters, fluffing up the desserts, making sure everything was picture perfect. I could see her shoulders tense as she moved around the kitchen, murmuring little reminders to herself under her breath. Check the glaze, reheat the rolls. Don't forget the mint garnish. It was like watching a professional chef running her own restaurant. By mid-morning, the house smelled like heaven. Roasted lamb, buttery mashed potatoes, fresh baked bread, lemon zest, and warm vanilla from the desserts waiting in the fridge. The dining table looked straight out of a magazine, crisp white linens, lavender accents, hand-written menus placed on each plate, and little floral centerpieces in mason jars that my daughter had made herself. She was so proud of how everything turned out. She twirled once in the living room, looking at the setup, and whispered, "It's perfect." She even put on a soft playlist of my mom's favorite songs, saying she wanted the mood to be relaxing and full of love. By noon, everything was ready. She'd showered, put on the floral dress she'd been saving for this day, and curled her hair loosely, letting it fall around her shoulders. She had this glow about her, a mixture of exhaustion, excitement, and hope. She kept glancing at the clock, pacing back and forth, whispering, "They're going to be here any minute." And then my phone buzzed. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured someone was just checking if we needed them to bring ice or extra drinks. But when I picked it up, my stomach sank. It was a text from my cousin A. "Sorry, we can't make it today. Josh has a last-minute soccer tournament." I frowned but brushed it off. One cancellation out of 23 people wasn't a big deal, right? Except a minute later, another notification came in. Then another. And another. Within 15 minutes, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My aunt messaged saying she wasn't feeling well. Another cousin claimed their car wouldn't start. Someone else said they had unexpected plans they couldn't get out of. One by one, the excuses piled up like a slow, moving avalanche I couldn't stop. I didn't want my daughter to notice, so I slipped into the hallway, quietly replying to the texts, trying to stay calm. I told myself, okay, even if half the guests cancel, there are still plenty of people coming. It'll be fine. But then I saw the message that changed everything. It was from my mom, the person this entire celebration was for. A simple, casual text. "Hey, sweetie," something came up. "Can't make it today. We'll celebrate another time." Sorry, I froze. I just stood there, staring at the screen, reading and rereading those words, my heart pounding in my ears. My mom. The guest of honor. The reason my daughter had spent 3 sleepless nights cooking, baking, and preparing every tiny detail. She wasn't coming. She didn't even call. Just a short text like it was nothing. I felt this strange numbness spread through me, like I couldn't process what I was seeing. I walked back into the kitchen slowly, trying to compose myself, but my daughter must have seen my face because she stopped stirring the punch and looked at me immediately. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice tentative, cautious. I hesitated, trying to find the gentlest way to tell her, but I didn't have to say much. She could read it in my expression before the words even left my lips. "Grandma's not coming," I whispered. For a second, she just blinked at me, like her brain couldn't quite register what I'd said. Then she tilted her head slightly, her lips parting like she was about to laugh at what she assumed was a bad joke. But when I didn't smile, her entire face changed. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw clenched, and her eyes started to glisten. She whispered, almost to herself, "She's not coming?" The disbelief in her voice broke me. I wanted to lie, to make up an excuse that would soften the blow, but I couldn't. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She stood there frozen for a moment, like someone had hit pause on her entire body. Then she looked around the room, at the perfectly set table, the steaming trays of food, the flowers, the carefully arranged candles, and I could see the weight of it crashing down on her all at once. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and she bit down hard on her lip, trying to keep her composure, but a single tear slipped down her cheek anyway. I stepped toward her to hug her, but before I could, my phone buzzed again. Another text, then another. Out of 23 invited guests, 18 had canceled. She finally broke the silence. Why didn't anyone tell us sooner? She whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. How could I explain to her that people just didn't care enough? That they knew how hard she'd worked and still chose to bail? I couldn't say that. So instead, I told her maybe something unexpected had come up for everyone. Maybe it was just bad timing. Maybe we'd have a smaller, more intimate dinner and still make it special. But she wasn't buying it. She just stared down at her hands, twisting her fingers together tightly, her breath uneven and shallow. And then, almost in a whisper so faint I almost missed it, she said, "Was it me? Did I do something wrong?" That question hit me like a knife to the chest. No, she didn't do anything wrong. She did everything right. She went above and beyond for people who couldn't even be bothered to show up. And yet, there she was, questioning her worth, questioning whether her effort even mattered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call everyone who canceled and make them understand exactly what they had done to her. But instead, I just pulled her into my arms and held her tight, stroking her hair as she finally let the tears fall. She tried to muffle her sobs, but I could feel her shaking against me, her body trembling under the weight of disappointment. The clock kept ticking, but the silence in the house was deafening. The beautiful playlist of my mom's favorite songs played softly in the background, mocking us with its cheerful melodies. The food sat untouched, steam curling lazily from the serving trays, filling the air with scents that now felt heavy instead of joyful. All that work, all that love, all that anticipation, and in a matter of minutes, it had unraveled completely. She'd spent 3 days creating something extraordinary, and almost no one was coming to see it. I didn't know what to say to her. There were no right words in that moment. I just sat with her, holding her hand, trying to silently promise her that we'd get through this together, even though deep down, I was just as crushed as she was. I wanted to be strong for her, to shield her from the heartbreak, but the truth was, I was hurting too. Not for me, but for her. Watching her work so hard, watching her pour every ounce of herself into this celebration, only to have the people she loves most casually cancel without a second thought, it broke something inside me too. And then, as if to add salt to the wound, one final text came in. Let's reschedule for next weekend. We'll all make it then. Reschedule. Like it was nothing. Like 3 days of blood, sweat, and tears could just be penciled into another date on the calendar. I stared at the message, my jaw tight, my chest pounding with frustration. But when I looked at my daughter, her cheeks wet, her shoulders slumped, her beautiful dress wrinkled from where she'd been gripping it with her hands, I knew rescheduling wasn't the point anymore. This wasn't about the food. It wasn't about the decorations or the party. It was about her love, her effort, her heart, and how casually it had been dismissed. In that moment, the disappointment in her eyes said everything words couldn't. She had planned a celebration for someone she adored, and instead, she was left standing in a quiet house filled with enough food to feed 23 people, but barely anyone to eat it. It was more than just a canceled party. It was betrayal. It was heartbreak, and I knew then that this wasn't something she'd forget anytime soon. I sat beside her on the edge of the couch, watching her stare down at her trembling hands, and I could feel the heaviness in the room swallowing us both whole. She was silent at first, completely frozen, as if her mind was trying to process the weight of what had just happened. The sound of the playlist playing softly in the background, my mom's favorite songs, suddenly felt cruel, almost mocking, filling the air with cheerful melodies that no longer matched the mood. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my daughter whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" Her voice was barely audible, fragile, like she was afraid to even speak the words out loud. I turned toward her immediately, holding her face in my hands so she would look at me. "Sweetheart, no. You did everything right," I said, my voice firm even though my throat was tight and my eyes were already burning with tears. "You poured your heart into this. You worked harder than anyone should ever have to for a dinner. None of this is your fault." But she shook her head, her lips quivering, tears brimming in her wide, glassy eyes. "Then why didn't they come?" she whispered, her voice cracking mid-sentence, and the helplessness in her tone broke me. in ways I didn't think possible. I didn't have an answer. How do you explain to someone who gave her all, her time, her love, her energy, that sometimes people just don't value that effort? I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, that some people make careless choices without thinking of the consequences, because I knew that would only hurt her more. So I tried to reach for anything comforting. Sometimes, people make decisions without thinking about how it affects others. I said softly, brushing her tears away with my thumb. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It doesn't mean your effort didn't matter. It matters. It mattered so much. She tried to nod, but the tears spilled over anyway, sliding down her cheeks one after another. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a quiet sob, and I pulled her into my arms immediately, holding her as tightly as I could. Her small frame shook against me, and I could feel the deep, aching heartbreak radiating from her like a physical thing. She kept whispering, I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted Grandma to be happy. I stroked her hair, whispering, you did everything you could, baby, everything. This isn't on you. I wanted to stay strong for her, but as I held her, I could feel my own chest tightening, my jaw clenching, and my throat burning with unshed tears. I was angry. Angry at my mom for bailing at the last minute, angry at the family for not showing up, and angry at myself for not protecting my daughter from this moment. I had watched her work herself to exhaustion for 3 days, putting every ounce of love into this celebration, and in return, she got silence, excuses, and a casual dismissal from the very people she wanted to honor. I kept thinking about all the times she'd ask me, do you think they'll like this dish? Do you think Grandma will love this cake? And how excited she was to watch everyone's faces light up when they tasted the food. All those dreams shattered in one afternoon. The worst part wasn't the wasted food or the empty seats at the table. The worst part was watching her question herself. Watching her doubt her worth because other people couldn't be bothered to show up. It's a kind of pain that digs deeper than words can describe. She had worked harder than anyone, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. This was her way of showing love, and that love was met with indifference. That kind of rejection leaves scars, especially on someone who gives so much of herself. I remember standing up after a while, walking into the kitchen just to collect myself. But when I looked around, the sight of it nearly broke me all over again. Every counter was covered in beautiful dishes she had made from scratch. Trays of roasted lamb, creamy mashed potatoes, perfectly golden bread rolls, delicate puff pastries, rich sauces, vibrant salads, and an entire dessert spread that looked like something out of a bakery display. It was incredible. She had created something extraordinary, and yet the house was quiet, empty, and heavy with disappointment. The table was perfectly set, the candles lit, the hand-written menu cards placed neatly on each plate, and yet there would be no one to read them. It felt surreal, like walking into the aftermath of a dream that had dissolved right before your eyes. When I returned to the living room, she was sitting there, wiping her face, trying to hold herself together even though her chin still trembled. I sat beside her again and took her hand in mine. Listen, I said softly, forcing my voice to stay steady. What you did matters. You put so much love into this. That love doesn't go away just because people couldn't be here to receive it. She shook her head slowly, whispering, but it feels like it doesn't matter, like I wasted all of it. That sentence shattered me because I knew that, in her heart, she wasn't just mourning the canceled party. She was mourning the connection she thought she had with the people she loved. A connection she thought would make them show up, no matter what. I wanted to scream, to pick up the phone and call every single person who canceled, to tell them exactly what they had done to her. I wanted them to feel the weight of her disappointment, the sting of her tears, the crushing silence in this house that should have been filled with laughter. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because I knew that wouldn't heal her pain, it would only deepen the wound. So instead, I just held her hand tighter and stayed there beside her, letting her know in the quietest way possible that she wasn't alone in this. Eventually, after what felt like hours, she whispered, "Can we do something with the food?" I don't want it to just sit there. Her voice was shaky, but there was this small glimmer of strength in her words, like she was trying to find purpose in the middle of her heartbreak. That's who she is. Even in pain, she looks for ways to make something good come out of it. And in that moment, I realized just how big her heart really was. She wasn't just sad about people not showing up, she was sad that the effort, the love, the food she had poured herself into would go to waste. That was my daughter in a nutshell. Selfless, thoughtful, and endlessly giving, even when the world didn't give back. And yet, even as she tried to find a silver lining, I could see the heaviness in her eyes. It wasn't just disappointment anymore, it was something deeper, something quieter, like a part of her spirit had dimmed. She had believed in this day so completely. She had built up a vision in her mind of family gathered around the table, laughing, sharing stories, eating the food she'd so lovingly prepared. And when that vision was shattered, something inside her cracked too. She would smile faintly when I reassured her, but I could tell it didn't reach her heart. That night, long after the canceled celebration, I stood by her door and listened to the muffled sound of her crying softly into her pillow. I leaned against the wall, silent, wishing more than anything that I could take her pain away. But there are some lessons in life that no one can shield you from. Lessons about love, effort, and how sometimes, no matter how much you give, people will still let you down. And knowing she had learned that so young, that was the hardest part of all. That evening felt like stepping into an entirely different world. One where time had slowed down and the silence was deafening. Hours earlier, this house was supposed to be alive with energy, laughter, and the sound of 23 voices talking over one another while enjoying the feast my daughter had poured herself into. Instead, the living room was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The soft playlist that had been playing all day had long stopped, the candles sat unlit, and the perfectly arranged dining table looked almost mocking now, as if reminding us of what should have been. My daughter sat at the far end of the couch, still wearing the floral dress she had chosen for the celebration. But now it was slightly wrinkled from the way she'd been twisting the fabric nervously in her hands. Her mascara had smudged faintly beneath her eyes, though she didn't seem to notice or care. She wasn't crying anymore. But there was something worse than tears, the emptiness in her expression. The way she stared at nothing like her thoughts were locked somewhere far away, replaying the same crushing reality over and over. The food was ready. Everything was still warm. The roasted lamb, the creamy mashed potatoes, the butter, glazed vegetables, the trays of puff pastries, the herb-crusted bread, the sauces simmering gently on the stove, and the beautiful desserts waiting patiently in the fridge. The effort of 3 exhausting, sleepless days was displayed everywhere you looked. It should have been a moment of pride, a moment where everyone complimented her dishes and told her how incredible she was. Instead, it felt like standing inside an abandoned theater after the play had been canceled. All the work, the preparation, the energy, and yet no audience. My husband came downstairs quietly, sensing the heaviness, and sat beside us. He didn't say anything at first, just placed his hand gently on my daughter's shoulder. She looked at him briefly, offering the faintest, broken smile, but her eyes dropped quickly back to her hands. I tried to coax her into eating something, just a little bite, thinking maybe tasting the food she'd worked so hard on would bring some small spark of joy. "Sweetheart, the lamb smells amazing. Come on, let's just have a little together," I whispered, reaching for one of the plates. But she shook her head slowly, without even looking at me, and murmured, "It doesn't taste the same anymore." That one sentence shattered me. Her words carried more weight than she probably intended. It wasn't just the food. The meaning behind everything she had done was gone, erased by the absence of the people she'd wanted to share it with. She had envisioned this day so vividly, grandma at the head of the table, everyone laughing, clinking glasses, complimenting her cooking, taking pictures, celebrating love and family. Without them, the feast was just food. No matter how beautiful it was, it didn't feel like what it was supposed to be. After a long pause, she asked in the quietest voice, "Can we take the food somewhere? I don't want to throw it away." My husband and I exchanged glances, and I could see we were both thinking the same thing. She needed to find meaning in this day, some way to make her effort matter, even if the celebration had fallen apart. I nodded immediately. "Of course we can," I said softly. "We can take it to the shelter. They'll appreciate it more than you know." For the first time all day, I saw the faintest glimmer of light return to her eyes, though it was fleeting and fragile. She stood slowly, smoothing down her dress as if bracing herself to take control of something, anything, in a day that had spiraled out of her hands. We spent the next hour carefully packing up everything. Every tray, every plate, every dessert was placed gently into containers and sealed with care. My daughter handled the desserts herself, making sure they wouldn't get damaged in transit. Even though her movements were quiet, deliberate, and heavy with sadness, there was still so much grace in the way she worked. I watched her softly close each lid and wipe down the edges of the trays. And I realized something about her in that moment. Her love didn't just vanish because she was hurt. Her instinct was still to give. That realization nearly brought me to tears. The drive to the shelter was quiet. The car smelled like roasted herbs and sugar, an odd mix of sweet and savory that hung in the air and clung to us like a reminder of everything that had been lost today. I kept glancing at her in the passenger seat, watching the way she stared out the window, lost in thought, her reflection in the glass softened by the faint glow of the streetlights. Her hands were resting in her lap, clutching the handwritten menu cards she had made. She'd insisted on taking them with us, saying maybe the shelter could use them to know what each dish was. I thought about how carefully she had written them, how she had doodled tiny flowers in the corners, how proud she had been of them this morning. Now, she was holding them like a reminder of a dream that never came true. When we arrived at the shelter, we carried in tray after tray of food. The volunteers there were stunned. Their eyes went wide when they saw how much we'd brought and how beautifully everything was prepared. "Did you make all of this?" one of them asked, genuinely amazed. My daughter nodded shyly, and the volunteer smiled warmly, saying, "This is incredible. You have no idea how many people you're helping tonight." They kept thanking her, over and over, calling her sweetheart, calling her an angel, saying how rare it was for someone to give this much. For a brief moment, I saw her cheeks flush with a hint of pride, and I swear I saw the faintest spark of life return to her eyes. On the drive back home, she was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, softer, calmer, like giving the food away had taken at least a small piece of the weight off her chest. Still, when we walked back into the house, the silence greeted us again, heavy and cold. The balloons were still floating gently above the table, the banner still hung above the doorway, and the untouched glasses of punch still sat waiting on the counter. I watched her pause in the doorway, taking it all in, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her dress. Then, without saying a word, she walked upstairs and closed her bedroom door softly behind her. Later that night, I stood outside her room, listening to the faint sound of muffled sobs. I wanted so badly to knock, to go inside to hold her, but something in me stopped. I knew she needed space. I leaned against the wall, tears finally sliding down my own cheeks, feeling helpless and angry all at once. This wasn't just about one missed dinner. It was about a promise broken, a dream crushed, and a heart bruised by people she trusted the most. That's the part that stung, not the wasted food, not the empty chairs, but the feeling of being unseen, unappreciated, and unimportant to the very people she had worked so hard to honor. I lay awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, replaying the day over and over, wondering what I could have done differently. Could I have warned her not to expect too much? Could I have called everyone personally to confirm? Could I have softened the blow somehow? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't something I could fix for her. This was one of those moments in life where someone learns, painfully, that not everyone shows up for you the way you show up for them. And there's no way to make that lesson less cruel when it lands. That night, our house was filled with the smell of food, but there was no celebration, no laughter, no clinking of glasses or cheerful chatter, just silence. And in that silence, I sat on the couch alone, staring at the table that had been set so beautifully, and I made myself a quiet promise. I would make sure my daughter never felt this kind of heartbreak alone again. She deserved better, better than excuses, better than casual texts, better than being overlooked after giving so much of herself. That promise burned deep into my heart as I blew out the few candles we'd lit and turned off the lights in the kitchen. The house settling into an uneasy, aching quietness that mirrored what we all felt inside. The next morning, sunlight poured into the kitchen, but it didn't bring warmth. It felt harsh somehow, like it was exposing every quiet H that had settled into the house overnight. I woke up earlier than usual, partly because I hadn't slept well, but mostly because I knew we couldn't avoid the inevitable conversation anymore. We had to talk to my mom, the woman my daughter had spent 3 days working so hard to honor, the woman whose birthday dinner had been the entire purpose of this feast. My hands shook slightly as I made my coffee, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what kind of response we were going to get. Would she apologize? Would she understand how deeply this had hurt my daughter? Or would she brush it off the way she sometimes did when she didn't want to feel guilty? I wanted to protect my daughter from more pain, but I also knew she needed closure. When she came downstairs a little later, she was quiet but composed. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she was wearing one of her oversized sweaters, the sleeves pulled down over her hands like she wanted to disappear inside them. Her face was pale from exhaustion, and her eyes were still puffy from crying, though she tried to hide it. She sat across from me at the table and sipped the tea I'd made her, staring at the steam rising from the mug like she was lost somewhere far away. After a long silence, she whispered, "Are you going to call Grandma?" Her voice cracked slightly at the word grandma, and I felt my throat tighten. I nodded slowly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Yes, sweetheart, I am, and you can sit here with me if you want or not. Whatever feels better for you." She hesitated, glancing at the phone sitting on the counter, and after a moment she nodded. "I want to hear what she says." I took a deep breath and dialed. The phone rang a few times before my mom finally picked up, her voice cheerful and bright, like nothing had happened. "Oh, hey, honey," she said casually, as though yesterday hadn't ended with my daughter's heart in pieces. "How's my birthday, girl? I still can't believe I'm another year older." She chuckled softly, but her tone was too light, too relaxed, and I felt a knot twist in my stomach. "Mum," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk about yesterday." There was a small pause on the other end, just long enough to sense that she knew where this was going. "You know," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "she spent 3 days cooking for you. For everyone. 23 dishes. 3 straight days without resting, and when nobody showed up, it crushed her." My voice cracked slightly, and I had to swallow hard to keep it together. For a moment, there was silence, and then my mom sighed. Not the kind of sigh filled with regret, but the kind that says I'm already tired of this conversation. "Oh, sweetheart," she said finally. "I didn't think it would be that big of a deal. Plans changed. People got busy. We ended up deciding last minute to go out for dinner instead." I figured you'd understand. Her words hit like ice water. My daughter stiffened in her chair, gripping her mug tighter, her knuckles turning white. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to breathe through the frustration boiling inside me. "Understand?" I repeated slowly. "She spent 3 days in the kitchen. She hasn't slept properly. She cried herself to sleep last night, Mom. And you're telling me you just assumed it wouldn't matter that you and everyone else didn't show up?" My mom chuckled awkwardly, as though she wanted to brush the entire thing under the rug. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. She's young. She'll get over it. I didn't think she'd take it that personally. Besides, there'll be other dinners, right? No need to dwell on one missed evening." I stared at the phone in disbelief, struggling to find the words, because I knew in that moment that my daughter was hearing every single syllable. I could feel her heartbreak deepening beside me. Her lower lip trembled, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears that were threatening to spill over. But she stayed silent, staring down at her mug like if she didn't move, maybe the pain would hurt less. "Mum?" I said finally, my voice lower now, firmer, because anger was beginning to seep into my tone. "This isn't just about dinner. This is about respect. About showing up for someone who put her heart and soul into celebrating you. She's not asking for the world, just for your time and acknowledgement. She loves you, and she wanted yesterday to be special for you. Do you understand what it feels like for her to believe she wasn't worth showing up for?" There was another pause, but this time it was shorter, and when she spoke, her voice had a hint of irritation. "I think you're blowing this way out of proportion," she said. "I didn't ask her to cook. That was her choice. She didn't have to do all that work if she couldn't handle disappointment. I love her, of course I do, but I'm not going to feel guilty for changing plans. Life happens." I couldn't speak for a moment. I felt the air leave my lungs, and all I could do was stare at the table, clenching the phone tighter in my hand as my daughter sat there, frozen. Absorbing those words. She didn't cry this time. She didn't move. She just sat perfectly still, like if she stayed quiet enough, maybe she could disappear completely. That silence from her hurt more than any sobs ever could. I realized in that moment that there was no apology coming. No understanding. No acknowledgement of the effort, the love, the care my daughter had poured into this. And that's when something inside me shifted. I took a slow, deep breath and said calmly, "All right, Mom. I think we're done here." I didn't wait for a response. I hung up, set the phone down on the counter, and sat there in silence for a long moment. When I finally turned to my daughter, she was staring at the table, her expression blank but her eyes glossy with unshed tears. I reached across the table and took her hand gently, squeezing it without saying anything at first. After a long pause, she whispered, "She didn't even care, did she?" The tremble in her voice broke me. I shook my head slowly, squeezing her hand tighter, and said softly, "She should have. You deserved better than this." That was all it took for her composure to shatter. She let out a quiet sob, finally breaking down, her face burying into her sleeves as her shoulders shook. I slid my chair beside hers and wrapped my arms around her, holding her close while she cried. It wasn't the loud kind of crying. It was the silent, painful kind where the hurt runs so deep that words can't even find their way out. We sat there like that for what felt like hours, just holding on to each other while the kitchen filled with the sound of soft, muffled sobs. The smell of yesterday's food still lingered faintly in the air, like a cruel reminder of everything she'd lost. Not just the dinner, but the sense of being valued, seen, and appreciated by the people she loved the most. I rubbed her back gently, whispering over and over, "I'm here. I've got you. You're not alone." As the day stretched on, I watched her retreat deeper into herself. She barely touched her tea, barely spoke, barely moved. Every time her phone buzzed with another message from cousins or relatives, she ignored it. I knew why. None of them had shown up, and now they were sending half-hearted texts to check in, pretending like their absence hadn't left a wound. By evening, I found her sitting out on the back porch, knees pulled up to her chest, her sweater sleeves wrapped around her hands. The sun was setting behind her, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, and she stared out at it like she was trying to find answers in the fading light. I sat down beside her, quietly resting my hand on her back, and for a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the day fade into night. Finally, she spoke in a fragile whisper. "I don't think I can do this again. Not for them." There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from giving everything you have and feeling invisible anyway. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and whispered back, "You don't have to, sweetheart. You never have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm." At that moment, I knew this was a turning point for her. Something inside her had shifted, not in a bitter way, but in the quiet, sobering way that happens when you realize you have to protect your heart. And as much as it broke me to see her hurt, I also knew this was the start of her learning an important, if painful, truth sometimes. The people we love the most won't show up for us, and we can't let their absence define our worth. The following days moved slowly, like time itself had thickened under the weight of what happened. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost alive, clinging to every room and every thought. My daughter hardly spoke. When she did, her words were quiet, careful, as though she was afraid of letting too much slip out at once. She avoided the kitchen entirely, couldn't bear to look at the dishes she had so lovingly prepared, and I didn't push her. I handled the cleanup alone, scraping away food that had been made with so much care, each spoonful of wasted effort cutting deeper into my chest. The clatter of pans and plates echoed louder than usual, and with each sound, I could feel the resentment simmering quietly beneath the surface. Not at her, but at the people who had caused this hurt, people who didn't even seem to understand the depth of the wound they'd left behind. My mom hadn't called again. No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. A few relatives had sent casual texts, the kind that read like flimsy band-aids over a gaping wound. "Sorry, something came up last night. Hope you understand?" Or, "We'll celebrate next time." None of them reached out to her directly, though. It was always to me, as though it was easier to pretend this was an inconvenience for me rather than heartbreak for her. I didn't show her the messages. I knew they'd only deepen the sting. On the third night, I found her sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, her laptop open but untouched on her lap. The soft light from the screen cast shadows under her tired eyes. She was scrolling aimlessly, not really looking at anything, her expression distant. I sat down beside her, hesitating for a moment before placing my hand gently on her arm. She didn't move away, but she didn't look at me either. "You're allowed to be angry," I whispered softly. Her eyes flicked toward me for just a second before dropping back to the floor. "I'm not angry," she murmured, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. I feel stupid. Like I put in all this effort, and for what? It's like I don't matter to them." Hearing those words from her, my strong, kind, passionate daughter, nearly broke me. I swallowed hard and pulled her into my side, wrapping an arm around her. "You do matter?" I said firmly, my voice trembling despite how hard I tried to steady it. "Their actions don't define your worth. What you did, the love you poured into this, that was beautiful. They couldn't see it, but that doesn't make it any less real." For a long time, she didn't reply. But then, in the quietest voice, she whispered, "It feels real to me, and it hurts." That night, after she finally drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, I sat there in the dim light, scrolling through my phone, reading through messages from family members who didn't seem to grasp the weight of what they'd done. I typed out responses, deleted them, typed again, deleted again. Nothing seemed enough to capture the depth of what I was feeling. Anger, disappointment, sadness, all tangled together. Eventually, I put the phone down and just sat there, staring at the faint glow of the kitchen light, listening to the silence that had settled into the house. The next morning, something shifted. When I went into her room to check on her, I found her already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed, a notebook open in her lap. She looked up at me briefly and offered a small, tired smile. "I think I need to write," she said simply. I nodded, stepping closer and brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you want me to leave you alone?" I asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. Over the next few days, she filled that notebook with page after page of her thoughts. Messy, raw, unfiltered. At first, she wouldn't let me read anything, and I didn't ask. I could see the process was helping her, even if just a little. There was something healing about putting pain into words, about dragging feelings into the light instead of letting them rot in silence. It was on the 5th day when she came downstairs holding the notebook tightly against her chest, her fingers pressing into the worn edges. "Can I read you something?" she asked, her voice small but steady. I nodded, setting aside the dish towel I'd been holding and sitting down at the table. She opened the notebook carefully, like the pages were fragile, and began to read. Her words poured out in a trembling voice, describing every moment of that day. The cooking, the anticipation, the ladder she imagined filling the house. The way the clock kept ticking while the door stayed closed, and the crushing silence when she realized nobody was coming. She wrote about how she had smiled through the disappointment at first, pretending it didn't hurt, until the dam finally broke later that night. She wrote about feeling invisible, about wondering if she was worth showing up for, and about how the love she had poured into those dishes had felt wasted, thrown away like leftovers nobody wanted. By the time she finished, her cheeks were streaked with tears, and so were mine. I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine, holding it tightly as we sat there in silence for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle between us. "This is beautiful," I said finally, my voice shaky. Painful but beautiful. "I'm so proud of you." She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the notebook. "It doesn't change what happened," she whispered, "but at least now it's mine." The story's mine, not theirs. Something about that struck me deeply. It was true. What happened had hurt her, but she was reclaiming it, turning it into something that belonged to her, not just an open wound inflicted by people who hadn't thought about the consequences of their choices. A week later, without warning, my mom showed up at our door. I wasn't expecting her. I hadn't heard from her since the phone call, and my stomach tightened the second I saw her standing there, holding a cake in one hand and wearing that awkward smile she put on when she didn't want to confront something directly. "I came to see my granddaughter," she said softly when I opened the door. I hesitated, unsure what to say, but before I could respond, my daughter appeared behind me, standing there silently. My mom's face softened when she saw her, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was here to apologize. But instead, she stepped forward and said lightly, "I thought we could have a little celebration today. Just us?" My daughter stood there quietly, her expression unreadable. She didn't move, didn't answer. Finally, she said, "I don't want to celebrate right now." Her voice was soft but steady, and I felt a rush of pride at her quiet strength. My mom blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Sweetheart, I didn't mean to upset you," she started, reaching out a hand. But my daughter took a small step back, shaking her head. "You didn't upset me?" she said simply. "You hurt me, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. My mom's hand slowly fell back to her side, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across her face, maybe regret, maybe shame, maybe just discomfort at being confronted so directly. She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, realizing perhaps that nothing she could say right then would undo what had been done. After a long pause, she nodded slightly and whispered, "Okay," without another word. She turned and walked back down the steps, the small cake still in her hand. We stood in the doorway, watching her leave, neither of us saying anything until she was gone. When I finally turned to my daughter, she was staring at the ground, her arms folded tightly across her chest. I reached out, touching her shoulder gently, and she looked up at me with tired but resolute eyes. "That was brave?" I whispered. She shook her head. "It didn't feel brave?" she said softly. "It just felt necessary." That night, we sat together on the porch again, the same place we'd been the night after it happened, but this time, the air felt different. There was still pain, yes, but there was also strength. A quiet, steady kind of strength that comes from surviving something that could have broken you. I knew healing wouldn't happen overnight, It would come in waves, some days heavier than others. But as I looked at her, my resilient, kind-hearted daughter, I knew one thing for certain. She was learning how to protect her heart without closing it off completely. And maybe, just maybe, we were both learning something bigger. That family isn't just the people you're related to, it's the people who show up when it matters. In the weeks that followed, our lives slowly settled into a new rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The house still carried traces of what had happened, like echoes you couldn't quite silence, yet within that lingering pain, there was a strange kind of growth taking place. My daughter, once so eager to please everyone, now moved through her days with a quiet awareness, as though the experience had peeled back a layer of innocence she hadn't even realized she had. It wasn't bitterness I saw in her, it was clarity. She had given her heart, her time, and her energy to people she loved deeply, only to realize that love wasn't always reciprocated in the way we hope. That realization hurt, but it also planted the seeds of something powerful: boundaries. It started subtly. She stopped rushing to answer family group messages right away. She didn't volunteer herself for every task, every favor, every request that came her way. When someone asked if she'd help plan the next gathering, she hesitated before saying, "I'll think about it." And for my daughter, who had always said yes without question, that small sentence was monumental. I could see it in her posture, in the steadiness of her voice, that she was learning to honor her own feelings before bending to the expectations of others. The first real test came 2 weeks later when my aunt called to invite us to another family dinner. "We want to make it up to her," she said brightly over the phone, as though a single invitation could undo 3 days of heartbreak. I hesitated, glancing at my daughter, who was curled up on the couch, earbuds in, staring out the window. "I'll ask her," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. When I hung up and told her about the invitation, she paused for a long moment before speaking. "Do you want to go?" she asked softly, surprising me with the question. I blinked at her, unsure how to answer at first. "Honestly," I said after a moment, "I don't know." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I don't think I do," she admitted finally. "Not yet." I respected her choice. We stayed home that night, eating leftovers and watching movies instead, the kind of simple evening that soothed the both of us far more than any strained dinner could have. Still, I knew not everyone understood our decision. Messages trickled in from relatives. Why are you avoiding us? You can't stay mad forever." It wasn't that big of a deal. Each one stung in its own way, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how few people truly understood the depth of what had happened. One afternoon, my daughter came into the kitchen holding her phone, a crease forming between her brows. "Do they really think I'm overreacting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables and wiping my hands on a towel. "Some people can't see beyond their own perspective," I said gently. "They think showing up, or not showing up, is just about logistics. They don't understand that for you. It was about love, about being seen, about knowing you mattered enough for them to keep their promise." Her eyes softened, and she leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. "I don't want to hate them," she said quietly. I don't want to be hurt like that again." That became our turning point. We started talking openly about boundaries, about the difference between holding on to anger and protecting yourself from repeated harm. It wasn't about cutting people off entirely. It was about deciding how much access they had to our time, our energy, and our hearts. We agreed that until trust was rebuilt, we'd approach family events cautiously, taking things one step at a time. As weeks stretched into months, my daughter transformed in ways I hadn't expected. She threw herself into things that brought her joy, experimenting with new recipes, joining a local cooking class, and even starting an Instagram page to share her creations. I watched her reclaim her passion, not for anyone else's approval, but for herself. Every photo she posted, every caption she wrote, radiated a kind of quiet confidence I hadn't seen in her before. Then, one evening in early spring, she came to me with a shy smile, holding her phone out. "Look," she said, showing me her page. Overnight, one of her videos, a simple clip of her frosting a cake, had gone viral. Thousands of people had commented, praising her skills, encouraging her, telling her how beautiful her work was. I saw tears shimmering in her eyes as she scrolled through the messages. "They see me," she whispered, almost to herself. "People see me." And that was the moment I realized something profound. Sometimes the validation we crave from those closest to us never comes. And while that hurts, it also forces us to expand our circle, to find communities where we are valued and celebrated for who we are. Despite her growth, the family tension didn't simply disappear. At a larger family gathering months later, one we decided to attend after much discussion, the atmosphere was polite but strained. Some relatives acted as though nothing had happened, smiling too brightly and asking casual questions, while others avoided eye contact entirely. My mom approached us at one point, her face lined with something I couldn't quite read. Maybe regret, maybe guilt. She reached out to hug my daughter, who hesitated for a moment before allowing it. "I've been meaning to call," my mom said softly, almost as if confessing a secret. "I know I should have handled things differently. I'm sorry." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. My daughter nodded slightly, her expression calm but guarded. "Thank you," she said simply. That was all. The rest of the evening passed without confrontation, but as we drove home later, I asked her how she felt. She stared out the window, the passing streetlights illuminating her thoughtful expression. "I'm glad she said it," she admitted finally. "But it doesn't erase what happened. I can forgive her eventually, but I won't forget. And I think that's okay." And it was okay. Forgiveness didn't have to mean pretending the hurt had never existed. It could mean choosing peace for yourself without reopening old wounds for someone else's comfort. That night, I saw my daughter not as the heartbroken young woman who had spent 3 days cooking for people who never came, but as someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient than she had ever been. The entire ordeal, as painful as it had been, had reshaped her understanding of love, loyalty, and self-worth. She no longer chased after people who didn't show up for her. She learned to measure relationships not by bloodlines, but by actions. She learned that her value wasn't determined by anyone else's decisions, and that choosing herself didn't make her selfish. It made her whole. And perhaps the most beautiful part of all was watching her rediscover joy on her own terms. She laughed more freely now, cooked with more passion, and surrounded herself with friends and mentors who celebrated her rather than overlooked her. That empty dining table from months ago, once a symbol of betrayal, had transformed into something else entirely, a reminder that the love we give is never wasted, even if it doesn't land where we expect. It shapes us, strengthens us, and leads us to people and places where it is truly valued. In the end, the story wasn't about the disappointment of that night. It was about what came after. The strength my daughter found in herself, the boundaries she built to protect her heart, and the understanding that sometimes family doesn't always act like family. But that doesn't mean we stop loving or stop hoping. It just means we learn to love ourselves enough to stop breaking where others refuse to bend. And as I watched her one evening, standing in the kitchen with flour on her cheek and music playing softly in the background, I realized we were both healing in our own ways. Not because the people who hurt us had changed, but because we had. And maybe that was the greatest gift hidden in the pain. The chance to grow into a version of yourself you didn't know existed, stronger, softer, and wiser all at once.